Today we are going to open the darkest book in the witch's library, a book wrapped in black silk, stained with the reddest of blood, inhabited by lost souls and filled with tears. A book published in 6 volumes in the 19th century that haunted its readers for a long, long time. In 1862-1863, a highly anticipated Memoirs was eventually published, a memoir that everybody wanted to read. Fake memoirs and even novels had been written about this family a few years before. Honoré de Balzac himself wrote a book, Histoire d'un paria, about Charles-Henri, one of the members of this family. But in 1862, as he was retired, the last of the dynasty decided to tell everything, to clear the reputation of his family and to put to silence these fake memoirs. With the help of a ghostwriter who embellished his style, he published Les Memoirs des Sansons, 7 générations d'exécuteurs, 1688-1847, publié par Henri Clément Sanson, ancien exécuteur des hautes œuvres de la cour de Paris. He was very proud to publish it the same year that Les Misérables was published, as he was a big admirer of Victor Hugo, who wrote a lot against death penalty. This Memoirs is a unique testimonial, as all the members of the family, who were all executioners, wrote diaries, journals, manuscripts, confessions, to relate events of their lives, the difficulty of their jobs, their pain, and the practical details of the life of an executioner. Breathtaking, captivating, and extremely moving, no fiction or novel could compete with the dramas they experienced. How it all started. A few months before his death, Charles Sanson de Longueval destroyed his own portrait so that his descendants wouldn't know his face. And he wrote a manuscript to confess to his descendants the terrible crime and the remorse that had haunted his life and which has sealed his fate as all its descendants for 159 years. He reveals that in 1662, he met a beautiful young girl, Marguerite Joanne, who took care of him after he fell off his horse on a stormy night in front of her house. He was riding with his sister-in-law after his brother died, and he had been in love with his sister-in-law for years and years and years and hoped finally they could be reunited. but Colomb was killed in the accident, and he was healed and taken care of by the girl of this house. After he was healed, he was asked by Marguerite's father to leave the house and to never come back. He started to see her anyway, secretly, while her father was away, and a few weeks later, one night, he heard that his cousin, Paul Berthaud, he had met in Canada while he was traveling in Quebec during his years of traveling, that Paul has also noticed Marguerite, and he had planned to make her fall asleep, thanks to a drug, as her servant, and take advantage of her while her father was away. Charles heard of it, he went to wait for Paul, they fighted, but instead of leaving after Paul went away, he went himself in Marguerite's house, while she was asleep thanks to this drug. And he committed himself the terrible action Paul wanted to do on Marguerite. The next days, he would continue to see her, but he felt miserable. He felt so ashamed of himself, and he realized what he had done. What he didn't know at the time is that she was the daughter of Maître Joanne, the executioner of Rouen. After he was fired from his job, as he was riding one night not far from Marguerite's house, he writes in his manuscript what he saw. Je crus ouïr comme un gémissement qui venait de ce hangar. Bien que pas très facile à l'épouvante, il me souvient que mes chairs tremblaient et frissonnaient comme feuilles au vent. J'avais attaché mon cheval à un tronc d'arbre, je m'accotai contre la dite porte, je mis mon œil sur la fente la plus disjointe, et à ce que je vis, mes cheveux se guindèrent tout droit sur ma tête. Marguerite, mon aimée Marguerite, était ployée sur le lit de cuir qui sert à bâiller la question. Son bourreau de père, plus semblable à un tigre qu'à un homme, lui avait chaussé le brodequin du tourment. De sa propre main de père, il heurtait d'une maillotche le coin, tout rougi d'un sang qui était celui de son enfant. Et à chaque heure, il lui disait avec une enragée colère « Confesse, confesse !» Et la pauvrette, se rejetant en arrière avec force larmes et cris d'angoisse, prenait tous les saints du paradis et Dieu à témoin de son innocence. Je ne vis cette cruauté que pendant la moitié d'une minute, car j'avais déjà ramassé une poutrelle qui se trouvait là, et Dieu me prêtant une force que je ne m'étais jamais connue, d'un seul coup j'avais fait voler la porte en éclats, comme eût fait un pétard d'artillerie. En me reconnaissant, Maître Joanne jeta loin de lui sa maillotche, et empoignant la grande épée qui lui servait à décapiter les gentilshommes, il ne me menaça point, mais la brandissant autour de la tête de sa fille, il fit un affreux serment que si seulement je bougeais pour la secourir, il jetterait incontinent cette tête en bas des épaules qui la portaient.
The same night, he promised to Maître Joanne that he would marry Marguerite. He would not leave her like that, and they would live together. The only way he could do it is he had to become an executioner himself. His regiment and his captain fight him, all his friends left him and went away. He was instantly turned into an outcast. He left with his father-in-law and his wife for many years in Normandy, and then he came to Paris after his wife, Marguerite Joanne, passed away from tuberculosis. And he left and he went to live in Paris and became the exécuteur des hautes œuvres de la cour de Paris. And he came here with his son, whose name was also Charles. So this is how it all started.
For several centuries, beheading, hangings and executions on the wheel took place Place de Grève in Paris, in front of the city hall. If Parisians, when walking by, are a bit more careful, they might see the ghost and hear the cries of François d'Amiens, the most barbarous execution of the entire 18th century, which moved the entire Europe. He was condemned for régicide, an attempt of murder against the king on March 26, 1757. He was to be tortured on the scaffold with boiling oil, burning tar, wax and sulphur poured in his wounds, then torn apart by 4 horses and the remains of his body to be burned. The pain this poor man had to go through was so intense that his hair, which was entirely black before the execution, turned entirely white in 1 hour. We will not go into the detail of what François Damien suffered. As to make things even worse, nothing worked as planned during the execution. And don't think the executioners were happy to accomplish this monstrous job. It was the brother of Jean-Baptiste who had to do it. He was so disgusted and was so horrified by what he was asked to do that he resigned his job that very day.
Before we go further, we need to clear out many misconceptions, judgments, clichés you may have about executioners. One, that they were despised by everybody, that they were always seen with horror. They were wild beasts, uneducated creatures who enjoyed killing people. That they were wearing red clothes, their house was red, everything was very visible, that they were the executioners, and that they must have enjoyed torturing people. The Sansons, who came from a noble family, were actually very well educated people. When they were not putting people to death in their day job, by night they were studying plants, anatomy, they were doing their own remedies, they had a laboratory in their home to prepare all their remedies and potions, they were giving for free to poor people who would come to them because they couldn't pay for the doctor, and they would give their service and their remedies for free to any person who would come. And very often doctors who didn't know how to cure their patients, they would send their patients to them so that they would take care of them. And very often the executioner would save the life of people who would have been killed by the doctors. Though most people despised them, there was a community of sick and poor people who greatly valued their service, their kindness, their good heart, and the remedies they were giving to them. They were also well educated, they had a lot of hobbies. Charles-Henri, he liked to play the violin, he was doing some little concert at home. Of course, they didn't have any guests because nobody would come to the executioner's house, but he has 1 or 2 friends, especially a German musician who would play with him with the harpsichord. And actually, it's during one of their concerts they were doing together that this German musician and him found the way to improve the guillotine so that it would work perfectly. At this time, it was still a work in progress, the guillotine, and it needed some improvements. And it is during a concert they found a solution. They were also enjoying gardening, flowers. Henri and Henri Clément enjoyed theatre. The problem is they could never go together, the father and the son, because Henri, the father, would never want his son to be next to him to the theatre for fear that people would connect him to him, and he didn't want his son to suffer from his own reputation. So the Sansons were not dressed in red. Henri was only dressed in black because he suffered from his terrible job and he didn't want to wear any colors at all. And Charles-Henri, his father, so the grandfather of Henri Clément, he was extremely elegantly dressed. He had been forbidden to wear blue because blue is the color of nobility, but instead he was wearing green and richly embroidered jackets, riding coats, and his way of dressing was so famous that being dressed in green with embroidered jacket was known as to be dressed à la Sanson.
Behind the doors of their home, 16 Rue du Château d'Eau, formerly Rue Neuve-Saint-Jean, none of the execution sounds could be heard. Once their gate was closed, they lived an almost normal lives, celebrating anniversaries, doing nice Sunday lunches, although almost no friends joined them. The executioner, the hautes œuvres, is well paid, so they always had nice properties with large gardens, stables, houses for their servants and employees. Before Charles-Henri bought the house Rue Château d'Eau, they lived in an even larger property located between la Rue Bleue and la Rue Papillon. It is near le Faubourg Poissonnière, as le Faubourg Poissonnière is their favorite neighborhood. There is almost no houses at this time, but there is a lot of fields and a lot of gardens. And as Henri Clément writes in 1862, passers-by could hardly imagine when they cross la Rue Bleue or la Rue Papillon that they are walking on the cherished garden of an executioner, where he found peace peace, solace and comfort after accomplishing his terrible duty.
Henri Sanson is the superstar of the family because he was the executioner during the French Revolution and he had to put to death almost 3,000 people. Sometimes it was up to 60% per day. He's maybe the most charismatic of the family. He had his diary during these years, 1793, 1794, and he put down on paper all the persons he was putting to death. Just a way to make sense of this completely mad time and also to share his pain, his suffering, the growing difficulty he has to accomplish his job, and it is very moving.
18 Prairial, 1794. Les jours se suivent et se ressemblent. Encore 21 condamnés aujourd'hui. Il y en a qui prétendent qu'on se familiarise avec le sang. Lorsque ce sang est celui de nos semblables, cela n'est pas vrai. Je ne parle pas de moi, mais de mes aides que j'observe depuis qu'on nous fait guillotiner de pleines charrettes d'hommes et de femmes. 2 sont avec moi depuis 12 ans, 4 sont d'anciens bouchers, il est au moins 2 autres qui ne valent pas la corde qui servirait à les pendre, et de tout cela, il n'en est pas un seul dont le visage, lorsque la besogne est finie, ressemble au visage qu'il avait avant qu'il ne commençât. Le public n'y voit rien. Moi, je m'aperçois que leur cœur vacille, et quelquefois leurs jambes.
You might think we are very far from fairy tales in these very dark stories. We are closer to fairy tales than you think. In 1699, Angelique Tiquet was condemned to death. Angelique Tiquet was a very beautiful woman in her 40s, but still very beautiful and celebrated for her beauty in Paris. She had very long black dark hair falling to her waist, and she was condemned to be beheaded for the attempt of murder against her husband. And it happens that she also was a friend of Madame d'Aulnoy, who also did the same a few years earlier, but she was not condemned to death, she escaped. And it was Charles Sanson de Longueval, the very first of the dynasty, who will have to behead her. And for Angelique Tiquet, nothing went as planned. Everything went wrong from the beginning. When they arrived at Place de Grève, it was raining and pouring rain and storm, and they had to wait that the rain stopped before starting all the different steps for the execution. And during this time, Charles Sanson de Longueval, who had to behead her, was looking at her. He said that this moment has been one of the hardest of his life, to wait that the rain stops and to see this lady looking at elements who will put her to death, to see the carriage which will put her body back once the execution is over. And he was also fascinated by her as they were waiting that the rain stopped. He was looking at her and he found her extremely beautiful. She was reminding him of the two loves of his life, Colombe and Marguerite Joanne. And once eventually they started the execution, everything went wrong. He needed 3 times to behead her. The head didn't want to fall and her body was shaking and moving while he was trying to finish the beheading properly. After eventually her head fell on the floor, he left instantly the scaffold and ran like a madman, which he always did after each execution, and his employees took care of the rest. But he left every time he had accomplished his duty, and sometimes even terribly, because in that case everything went wrong. He would leave the place instantly to try to forget the terrible thing he just did. Though they are executioners, these men in their youth are exactly like any other gentleman of their age. They have the same hopes, the same desires, but unlike the other young men of their age, no girls want to approach them, no girls want to marry them, and it is very, very hard for them to court young girls and to marry. However handsome they are. Charles-Henri Sanson, the executioner of the Revolution, he was very handsome, he was very tall, very well built. He had quite a bit of success with ladies, provided they didn't know his real job. And he cheated a bit when he was in the world and he wanted to approach few girls. He never betrayed his identity. He always said he was whether an officer of the parliament, which he sort of was, but a very special one, or that he was le chevalier de Longueval. He was using the name of his relative from the 17th century. And once he even had a little problem and he was in serious trouble because of his usual way not to say things. He was in an inn with the Marquise, who ended up being there too. The Marquise invited Charles-Henri to have lunch, and they had a very good time. They were laughing, they were flirting, it went really well. Charles-Henri had to go back with his job, so he left afterwards. The moment he left, the owner of the inn came to the Marquise to tell her with whom she had had her lunch. And when she discovered that she had eaten with the executioner des Hautes Œuvres de la Cour de Paris, she freaked out, and the next day she put him into court for not saying the truth, for not telling and revealing his identity, that he should have a sign that everybody should see. Eventually won the trial. And before he married his wife, who was the daughter of some peasants from a very, very low background, and he was in a pretty good station in life. Executioners make very good money, and the Sanson family had a lot of real estate. So he's going to marry much, much, much lower of his station with the daughter of some peasants, but she was absolutely adorable. He loved her. She was 6 years older than him, which is a bit unusual for the time, but they had a very happy couple life. But before he married her, he had a passion for a young girl called Jeanne Vaubernier. Jeanne will become the famous Madame du Barry, the favorite mistress of Louis XV. And it was a real passion from his side. We don't really know if Jeanne was as in love as he was. She was dating a lot of men already in her late teens. As a young adult, she was already on the slope of becoming a prostitute. Charles-Henri went to try to save her from this terrible path, a bit like in Manon Lescaut, the famous novel of the 18th century. He wanted to do that. He wanted really to protect her and save her, which he didn't manage to do at all. It has to be said that Jeanne, at the same time, also had an affair with le Duc de Lauzun, that you already know. So she was very busy, this young lady. They will meet again in 1794. They didn't see each other for the past 30 years, and she had really changed a lot. She had put on a lot of weight. He could hardly recognize her, but it really grieved him tremendously when they were in the cart going to la Place de la Révolution to put her to death, to know all the shared memory they had and how important she had been in his youth. And to know that he will have to put her to death was a real tragedy.
As far as my recollection extends, I remember that he was very fond of gardening. He used to walk every day over his well-sanded garden. I can still see him, with his three-cornered hat, his knee breeches, his buckled shoes, his thin-bladed sword, and his heathered stockings. He used to stop before the flowers he had reared himself. He joyfully noticed their progress, their blooming. One day I remember that he exclaimed before a bush of tulips of the finest red, "How fresh, how red they are! If they saw them, they would say that I water them with blood." Young as I was, this word struck me. Some days before, I had heard an absurd vampire story, which had left a deep impression on my mind. Somehow or other, the two ideas got together in my head, and in the evening, I couldn't help asking my mother as I was going to bed, "Maman, grandfather says he waters his flowers with blood. Is it because he is a vampire?"
While in 1814, Napoleon and Louis XVIII were fighting for the throne of France, a much, much more important event took place in the life of Henri Clément Sanson, the last one of the dynasty. Henri Clément Sanson grew up without any siblings. He only had his parents, his grandmother, and their servants. And he had also a lot of pets, cats, dogs, and birds, and he was surrounded by a lot of animals. But he had no friends. His parents never agreed to send him at school. But eventually they agreed at 15 years old to send him to school. Till 15 years old, he didn't have any friend at all. He was always separated with all the other children. So at last he went to a school, Faubourg Saint-Denis, and he had there his first best friend. And once his friend suggested that he could come to his house and just to make a bit the journey after school to his house. Himself, he was living Faubourg Saint-Denis, and the family of Henri Clément was living Rue Château d'Eau, so they just had a little journey to go to reach the house. It was a little strange over there. Henri, the father, was not happy at all that this friend came to the house. He was a little angry with his son for that. And the next day, when he went back to school, the friend, he called him T in the memoirs, refused to talk to him. He didn't want to see him, didn't want to talk to him, ignored him completely. Henri Clément had no idea why, and he's going to explain in the memoirs what happened then. This is one of the most moving pages of the book when he revealed what happened to him.
Tu es cruel, lui dis-je. Non seulement tu m'as retiré ton amitié, mais encore, il semble que tu veuilles m'empêcher de la remplacer par celle d'un de nos autres camarades. Je ne sais ce que tu peux leur dire à tous, mais s'il s'en trouve un qui paraisse me sourire, sitôt que tu lui as parlé, je suis sûre de le voir comme les autres s'éloigner en me tournant le dos. T me regarda fixement, puis pour toute réponse, il haussa les épaules et se mit à crayonner sur une feuille de papier que l'on nous donnait pour nos dessins. Il faut que tout cela s'explique. Est-ce parce que mon père ne t'a pas mieux accueilli lorsque tu es venu avec moi à la maison ? J'en ai été plus vexée que toi. Mais ce n'est pas ma faute si depuis mon enfance l'on m'a voué au mystère et si l'on écarte de mon chemin toutes les figures humaines que je pourrais y rencontrer. Pour toute réponse, il me tendit le dessin qu'il venait d'achever. C'était une espèce d'estrade soutenue par 4 piliers et surmontée de 2 poteaux. On voyait une lame prête à tomber. Un homme était attaché sur une planche et un autre se tenait debout près de lui. En un mot, c'était la guillotine, le patient, l'exécuteur, et au bas de cette horrible image, T avait écrit en grosses lettres « Je n'avais pas vu comme T l'instrument du supplice, mais les mots écrits au-dessous du dessin me firent à l'instant même tout comprendre. Le mystère de ma vie venait de se dévoiler. À l'aspect du dessin que j'avais saisi, je poussai un cri d'horreur et d'épouvante, et m'enfuyant, hagard, désespéré, tenant toujours à la main cette feuille de papier qui venait de me faire une révélation si cruelle, je traversai en courant le corridor et la cour. La grille de clôture se trouvait entr'ouverte, je la poussai et passai avec la rapidité de l'ouragan devant la loge du concierge. Je descendis comme un fou tout le faubourg Saint-Denis. Arrivé à notre maison, je sonnai à coups redoublés. Lorsqu'on m'eut ouvert, je franchis pour ainsi dire d'un seul bond l'avenue et le perron. Ma mère qui m'aperçut de loin était accourue devant moi. Je tombais, évanouie à ses pieds, en lui tendant le dessin.
Though they had a very hard job, the Sansons throughout their lives, all the Sansons of the dynasty showed at different times of their lives unbelievable acts of humanity, kindness, and tried to help the people they were putting to death the best they could. Not only were they helping people by night with their remedies, the knowledge they have of plants, of anatomy, and the service they were giving to all the community of poor and sick people, but even in their job they were showing as much as possible some humanity and kindness where you wouldn't have expected. For example, in the cart going to la place de Grève or to la place de la Révolution, how many times Charles-Henri, Jean-Baptiste and all the other ones gave their coats, an umbrella to protect the person they were about to put to death so that they would have the less horrible journey to death as possible, and to protect them from the mob and the crowd who was a real monster on its own. They also agreed at many occasions to let the person go if someone wanted to come to fetch them on the scaffold and to liberate them, to let them go, which is very risky for them. They couldn't liberate them themselves, but they could at least not do anything and not prevent their liberation. The other thing they gave many times was le retentum. Le retentum was a line at the end of a judgment where the judge could say that after all, the person is about to die on the wheel, so rompu à vif sur la roue, so beaten to death on the wheel, but they will have the possibility to be strangled before the operation happens. And this happened many times. Most of the time the retentum was there. The judges could be human once in a while, so the crowd was never supposed to know that. They were supposed to ignore it completely and to know that the person would suffer tremendously. And once in a while, they didn't give the retentum, and it was a very special case with Le Comte Antoine de Horn, the very handsome 20-year-old Comte Antoine de Horn, who was suspected of murder against a man, and he was a cousin of Le Régent, le Duc d'Orléans, who was governing France at the time because Louis XV was too young, and Le Régent hated him, though he was connected to the entire aristocracy and nobility of Europe, Antoine de Horn. Nobody had enough power to prevent the execution to happen. So he was condemned to death. It happened also that he was the lover of the mistress of le Duc d'Orléans, the Régent, so you can imagine it added on the vengeance the Régent wanted to have against him. And after the torture session, after La Question, he was so bruised, his legs had been so tormented that he couldn't stand, he couldn't do anything. And Jean-Baptiste carried him in his arms on the cart and also on the scaffold. And he was hoping during the entire time on the cart that someone would come to liberate him. He was sure it would happen because many of his relatives came to his house to say how they could liberate him and organize a plan. And of course, Jean-Baptiste couldn't do anything, but he wouldn't prevent them to do something and to try something. So during the entire journey to the scaffold, he was hoping something would happen. And nothing happened. And the poor Antoine was completely devastated. And once he was attached on the wheel, Jean-Baptiste decided that he would do the retentum. There was no retentum for Antoine de Horn. He was supposed to die beaten to death. Taking advantage of the priest who was just in front of the body, there was the judges, which was on the building, watching the scene, watching that everything was properly done, and he took advantage that the priest was just in front of him to put a piece of string on the neck of Antoine de Horn so that he would be very discreetly strangled before anything happened to him. And he kept his promise. It was very risky and dangerous to do that. When there was no retentum, he was not supposed to do it. He decided to do it. And once his relative came to fetch the body, it was a very spectacular scene when all the carriage of all these noblemen came to fetch the body. They were all black carriages and black horses, all dressed in black. It was very impressive. And they were angry at first with Jean-Baptiste because he killed him, but it was his job. But he killed him before he suffered, and his closest relative was extremely grateful for that. In this completely inhuman execution, which was completely unfair because he didn't kill the person he was executed for, he never did this murder, at least someone showed a bit of humanity, and it was the executioner who promised him he had strangled him before anything happened to him. The end of the dynasty will end in 1847. Henri Clément Sanson, the very last one, will be fired from his job because he gambled the guillotine to pay his debts. He sold it, the government had to pay the guillotine back to use it, and he also had an affair with the Minister of Justice. It triggered a big scandal, as you can imagine. He was fired, the Minister of Justice was fired, his wife left him, and after the death of his mother, he decided to sell their beautiful house, Rue Château d'Eau, and the beautiful property they had here, and buy another house in the countryside, and live a very peaceful, quiet life, surrounded by plants, flowers, and animals, because Henri Clément, he loved his animals, his pets, his cats, his dogs, and his birds. And he lived a very, very quiet life over there, and he died at the very end of the 19th century. So with him, it is the end of the Sanson dynasty.
To meet les Sansons in Paris, we have to leave the noise of the city behind us and wander in the peaceful alleys of le cimetière de Montmartre. A small, humble and simple grave is the final home of the three last Sansons, Charles-Henri, Henri and Henri Clément. The simplicity of their grave contrasts with the spectacular mausoleums around them, as if they wanted at last to be unnoticed and be like anybody else. And it was not by lack of money, they had very comfortable income. Their names have almost entirely disappeared on the tombstones. Hopefully they have found the peace and the quiet they were longing for during their entire lives. The Memoirs of the Sansons were published in 6 volumes by Henri Clément Sanson in 1862 and 1863 and can be found newly published in French. They had been translated in 1876 in English, but are extremely abridged and a little butchered, as from the 2,700 pages from the French book, only 700 remain in the English edition. And if you are lucky, you might get your hand on the original edition just like me. Those memoirs are worth 10 novels by their emotional intensity, drama, and are utterly captivating and extremely moving. We only scratched the surface here, and so many stories would have been worth telling. The entire life of Charles Sanson de Longueval is filled with chaos and dramas. There are also the stories of Le Comte Antoine de Horn, Cartouche, Lalita Landal, which is unbelievable, and the love story of Charles-Henri for Jeanne Vaubernier, Madame du Barry, was so nice to read. And the happy endings too, and some miracles, because there also were miracles once in a while in their life.